Hello and welcome to Read This, Edinburgh's most powerful book podcast. On today's interview, I'm talking to Frank Rennie. Frank is Professor of Sustainable Rural Development at the University of the Highlands and Islands and the author of many books, including titles on the landscape of the Hebrides, the corncrake, and most recently, the Merlin. Subtitled The Ecology of a Magical Raptor, Frank's book The Merlin combines and contrasts his own personal observations and study of Merlins with accounts of Merlin watchers throughout history, producing a portrait of an enigmatic bird that refuses to be either pigeonholed or pigeon-hawked. In his book, Frank tells the story of the Merlin from its earliest fossil ancestors up to the behavioural adaptations being made by current populations around the world in response to the impact of climate change. On today's conversation, we talk about the wide variety of Merlin subspecies, how Mary Queen of Scots could clear up some of the mysteries connected to the Merlin, and Frank shares tips on how you can give yourself the best chance of spotting this notoriously elusive falcon. But since Frank opens his book with one of his poems about the Merlin, and since we are a literature podcast, I began by asking him about his relationship with poetry.
No, poetry is like sort of doodling to me. It's not, I've written a bit of poetry over the years. Some of it's been published, and there's sort of half a drawer full of whatnot. I wouldn't call myself a poet first and foremost, but quite often I've got another book, actually a manuscript is out for discussion just now, for consideration just now, and there's a poem in front of each of the session, each of those chapters on birds and whatnot. So it's a bit like sort of verbal doodling in that sort of sense. What I did quite normally do is when I'm thinking, I do a lot of writing quite a lot of books over the years, and quite often I just go for a walk around the croft or a walk around the countryside, write a bit at home, and then go out for a walk. And then while I'm out for a walk, something pops into my head. And quite often I find some of it is actually like short pieces of poetry, because it sort of measures in the time of your walking and the pace of your walking and the recitation of the poetry and whatnot, and things you see around you. So I was quite keen to put this poem on the Merlin at the start of the book, because it really, to me, it just encapsulates the thrill of Merlins when you're out in the moor and you just see this blur of activity, and it's over and gone before you've even known it's there, sort of thing. So I wanted to try and capture that in the text as well. So give it a sort of multi-dimensional way of thinking about Merlins.
You mentioned they're being hard to spot. You've also written about corncrakes as well as Merlins. Is there something that appeals about notoriously difficult to spot birds?
Well, yes and no, but I mean, I think both the corncrake and the Merlin are quite common here where I live in the northwest of Isle of Lewis, and so and they're, it's one of the, I would say, even the strongholds of both species. So I've been accustomed to them, watching them and learning about them for years, for decades. And the corncrake book was written quite often during lockdown, really. I wasn't having to drive 20 miles to Stornoway to go to work on the campus. So I gained another 5 hours every week from driving back and forward, half an hour each day, each way. And I thought, how can I put that to good use? And so I thought of the corncrake book, because I had been, a long, I would say almost lifelong interest in it. And I've always fancied doing something, but never really got around to it. And so I thought this is a good time to do it. And all the references and, online stuff that I'd built up over the years. So I did it. And then a friend was visiting after I published that, and we had another bird enthusiast, an ornithologist, and we had a conversation, at which point at the end I said, I'm really thinking of doing something on the Merlins. And he really was enthusiastic and encouraging me. And I kind of thought, yeah, maybe I should actually. If he's got the confidence to think that I could do it, then I should maybe just stop beating around the bush and get on with it. So that was, if it hadn't been for Des suggesting this, then I might not have actually put pen to paper or picked up my tablet and written about the Merlin. Because it's a really complex bird. It's one of the fascinations of Merlin for me is the sheer adaptability of the bird. We're used to thinking of these in terms of climate change and habitat loss and whatnot. There are undoubtedly huge problems facing much of wildlife, but it's really heartening to see something like the Merlin that just I don't want to make light of it, but decides, well, we can't do that anymore, so we need to do it this way in future.
Yeah.
And looking at it. I think I said it even in the introduction of the book. I mean, looking at it in the mega scale, the big scale, you looking at all these papers, journal articles over the many years, it gives you a different impression entirely, because almost every aspect of the bird, you can find people that say Merlins do this, they never do that. And yet, if you go widely enough in your search, you'll find other people who say Merlins always do that, they never do this, And it's about our human narrow focus on these things that conditions that, and just what we're used to seeing. And that mega study, that bigger scale thing, look at that. It makes you aware that being in the right place at the right time and being fortunate enough to see something unusual and knowing what it is, and then having the skill to identify that and then report that and discuss it, whatnot. These are all sort of narrowing activities that make it really 1 in a million, basically. And so, if you were there 2 minutes earlier or 3 minutes later, you would have missed it entirely. And even if you did see it and didn't know enough about ornithology or the species and whatnot, you wouldn't appreciate what you were looking at, and so you wouldn't even think it was unusual. And then even if you did, would you bother reporting it? Would you tell anybody? Where's your evidence? So there's a whole series of barriers and filters that and not just with Merlins, obviously. It doesn't really matter what it is. That this is in places like the Hebrides, we constantly, if you look at the biological recording map, there are big gaps all over the place. It's not because those species are not necessarily there. It's because no one's looked for them there, and if they have looked, they haven't found them, and so they just assume they're not there. And so the whole thing cascades. I mean, a really good example of that with the Merlin is the migratory. I mean, they are migratory in the sense that they leave the nesting grounds at the end of the nesting period. They may travel short distance, or they may go quite further, depending on what species and what part of the country they're in as a whole. Generally speaking, the females maybe go further away, further south, and that, and the males kind of hang around the area where they are, or travel a short distance anyway. It was said for years that they tend to migrate towards the coast, but I think that's probably because a lot of bird watchers are around the coast, all over the cities, and that's where they see them. They don't see them in other parts where they're just as common. But if you look at some of the North American examples and Canadian examples, particularly Saskatchewan, Alberta, these areas, over the past few decades, Merlins have, not all, but many have stopped migrating, and they continue to live in the city areas, probably because it has a regular supply of small birds throughout the year, so they don't have to travel to look for food, unlike if they were living on a moorland or a peatland environment, for example, where it's going to be more bare in wintertime. Also, there's a sort of heat bubble around the city, which maybe it's not quite so intimidating as if they're living on the prairie or in a more Arctic area. And sort of almost setting that against the dangers of migration, many pairs have found it that they don't have to migrate any longer. They just hang around the city, over the winter. And of course, the males quite often take advantage of that and get prime territory earlier than the birds who have migrated and then come back, further north towards to begin breeding again. So there are lots of advantages. It's not cut and dried, but there are advantages to that as well, rather than the risks of migrating over territory they don't know, with dangers that they don't know about, and all the stresses of flying and traveling and looking for food and so on. And that's really interesting. And if that is the case, why is that not more common? Why don't we see an explosion of Merlins in European cities, for example? Is it because it's less beneficial to them? I don't know. I mean, there's a whole fascination that opens up when you begin to look at some of these questions.
Yeah. Given how elusive they are, do you have any, from your own observance, do you have any tips for any giveaways, rather, of the Merlin, given that they're so often confused with other birds? I mean, from personal experience, sparrowhawks and peregrines and everything are often mixed up with Merlins. Is there any sort of sure way that you know what you're looking at is a Merlin?
Experience.
Yeah.
Experience, really. It's
Yeah.
the thing. I mean, Merlins are the smallest European falcon that we have. And so if you get a chance to see them perched on something, that gives you some idea, some example. They are much smaller than a peregrine, for example. The slate grey back of the male is another giveaway. You can see that quite clearly as it goes. But generally speaking, when you're in Merlin territory, they like to hunt very quickly, very low down. So maybe even a meter or a meter and a half above the ground, and they'll come scushing along there, just like and it literally is, as I say in the poem at the start, just like a blur. You just see this thing in your peripheral vision, and it's gone, and you think, oh my God, that was a Merlin. Because it just, and then they'll disappear, and because they'll just bed down into the heather or disappear into the landscape, and you won't see them again. When you're looking for them, when I'm looking for them, certainly out in the moor here, the northern part of Lewis, the northern moorland area, peatland area north of Lewis. I mean, it might have as much as 10% of the population of Merlins, in the country. So there's a lot of expectation when you go out there, but they're quite far out on the moor there, so you have to be fit and enthusiastic, because they're not right on your doorstep. They avoid the fringes of settlement, if you like. And what I do is I look for these raised peat mounds. So they're just like sort of small hillocks, I mean, maybe only a meter or so high, but they're dotted all over the flat plain, if you like, of the peatland. And I wander from one to the other. And when you get there, you may find casts, pellets that have been cast out, or remains of a songbird that's been disemboweled and eaten there, and you see all the remains, or fecal spray if they're sitting there. So you get these clues as to that there's something been there. That's a regular perch where they sit, and perhaps where they take food to eat. And so from that you can say, well, they're in this area somewhere, maybe quite a big area, but quite often that is within sight of their nesting area. And so maybe just quietly sitting down for a while with the glasses, looking around there, seeing there's stuff there. If you go earlier in the season, I'm talking about maybe April or maybe even end of March, beginning of April, when they're starting courting behaviour, you'll hear them. That's sort of really aggressive, from a distance. I mean, maybe a kilometre off, but you'll see where they are. They've spotted you because of the nature of the terrain. It's sort of very flat and undulating, and it means that they'll see you long before you see them. So you have to have your wits about you and just narrow down there. In traditional areas, they quite often they come back to the same general area, but not to the same nest site. They may have 3 or 4 different locations that are favourite locations for nests that they'll rotate in different years. So they'll be in the same area. So there's not really much point in staking out last year's nests, because there's a fair chance they won't come back to that particular net. But they might be quite close in the area. So it's just about trial and error. I mean, undoubtedly there are more times that I've gone out looking for Merlins and not found them than gone out and actually found or seen them. So it's just it's a labour of love, is it, in that sense.
You have a lovely image in your book of comparing how difficult they are to spot with how infrequently they are given full focus in literature, and you talk about how they are glossed in the lines of the field and in different field studies. Is there a reason why? Because they're so beloved, the Merlin. Is there a reason why they've received comparatively less focus?
It's a really good question, actually. I think maybe because, well, don't know. I think maybe because they are hard, they are problematic, they are hard, and so it's paradoxically easier here to see white-tailed eagles than it is to see Merlin, or golden eagle for that matter. But obviously they're bigger birds, but they're much more prominent because of their soaring behaviour and high in the sky. I mean, if I'm out for a walk and I hear grey-eyed geese going crazy, just and racing up from one field and scuttering away to some other field, there's a certain panic in their crying that I immediately start looking around the sky, and sure enough, with a bit of patience, you'll spot a dot further away in the horizon that's going to be probably a sea eagle. Keeping an eye out and hunting for them, and they do take these, but Merlins are much they're much smaller, they're faster, they're more adept. They, as I say, this low flying hunting technique they have is much more difficult to see, and I think they tend to get wrapped up with other descriptions of other raptors and whatnot, and some not all, but quite a few scientific articles will mention them by comparison, with other birds. So they don't do this, or they do that, unlike the Merlin and whatnot. And that's your clue as to what's behaviour, rather than a more detailed study of, because that requires a long time study and a lot of patience as it goes through. So I think they have been glossed over in the literature, and I think also this, quite fundamentally, the adaptability, the difference. So here in the north of Scotland, it's more common than not that there'll be ground nesting in long heather, for example, or bracken, maybe on some crags. But crags can be problematic because of they don't like to share crag with a peregrine, for example, for obvious reasons. They might rotate in different seasons as they shift their nests around. They might use the same crag, but they won't nest at the same time. But in North America, they're almost not quite all, but almost always in old crow's nests in trees. And so some parts of like Northern Ontario and whatnot, they're ground nesting, but by and large, they don't build their own nests. So they nest, even on the heather, they'll just nest in the nest of a crow's nest from last year. And so that's another reason, actually, now I think about it, for colonizing cities. So there's a direct correlation between trees that are planted for amenity purposes in cities and parks and avenues and so on. And when they reach a certain age, they reach a certain height, that they can support crow's nests. And then when the crows are finished with that nest, the Merlins say, thank you very much, and move in there. And so there's a direct, sort of cause and effect, if you like, within these things that goes through there. So, even to the extent that some Merlins in UK have migrated, moved from ground nesting to tree nesting. Obvious advantages: ground nesting predators, foxes, cats, whatever. They can avoid that for chicks. But so with new plantations, new forestry, quite often you might see a flurry of them moving into the forestry first, but then as it grows, it crowds them out, and they can't hunt so well through the more mature trees. But quite often you'll find them living on the edge of a forest. And for years, people who were surveying didn't even check that, because they just ruled it out mentally. You don't live in trees, And so it wasn't until people began to look at it, they realised that it's not a black and white thing. Sometimes they do, and quite often they'll live close to the forest margin on the moorland, but not too close. So the advantages of that would be that they have maybe some forest prey early in the season before the moorland picks up, but also they have predator control from grouse moor, for example, gamekeepers killing things that might threaten merlins. But at the same time, they have the sort of dual edge thing. So they may live on the forest edge or nest in the forest trees, even on the edge, providing there's enough hinterland of moorland to hunt over. So that's a key factor, having that huge area to begin to hunt. So these are all sort of you can't put them all into one basket and say, Merlins always do this. Well, they mainly do that, but not entirely. Conversation I had with a colleague in North America, and he'd mentioned in something he'd written about Merlins hunting over the forest canopy, or hunting in the forest. And I went back to him by email and said, "Hang on a minute, did you just say, we think in UK that they don't do this, and you say, oh yeah, but absolutely they do. On the Pacific coast, they'll live in forest clearing edges, or maybe adjacent to a small loch within a forest and whatnot, and they'll hunt throughout the canopy." And I thought, my God, this is, we tend to, because we so know little about their behaviour in many ways, we tend to sort of simplify things in our own head. But actually, the Merlin just says, this makes sense for me. That's what I'm going to do. So we have to learn so much more about that intimate behaviour that we don't jump to conclusions. And I think like things like, ringing. The returns from ringing birds is comparatively low. I mean, I think from memory, it's like 8 or 10% of birds that are ringed are recovered, and usually dead, hit by cars or flying into buildings or whatever. So it kind of skews the results of ringing. And Merlins returning to the area, their natal area, quite close to that sort of area, is well known. What would be really interesting for me would be putting satellite trackers on them to see where they go and how they move around there, because that would give you a more continual record of what they're doing, rather than just going and then come back again. This year, for example, in Lewis, I reckon that I've seen Merlins every month throughout the winter, certainly males throughout the winter, which suggests to me that they haven't moved away. They haven't migrated. They're still hanging around here, probably because there's still meadow pipits and starlings and whatever else that small birds to eat. But that's only anecdotal. You couldn't write that up in a journal and say for definite. But just being around the place and being out and about every day, that is the impression that I would get. I'd like to follow up and see if that is actually the case. Is there a tendency now, because of perhaps climate change, and we know that birds quite often in the north are nesting, the time scale is shifted, and they're nesting further north and maybe perhaps laying earlier because the weather's warmer and so on and so forth. Is that part of the reason that I'm seeing them all winter? In which case, that would be really interesting. And if you combine that with things like, there are records, there are sort of notes in the British birds one of the things you should not do if you're looking through the literature and literature reviews there is minimize the importance of small paragraphs that appear in the journals. We tend to gravitate towards chunky papers that give you a really in-depth idea. But if you're looking at the one paragraph in, I don't know, Scottish Naturalist or British Birds or something like that says, Merlin spotted in Wolverhampton in September. And then you think, wow, that's interesting. What they're going there. So there are records of Merlins, hunting through the streets of Glasgow or being on the south coast or through, in English cities and whatnot, going through there. Obviously, at times that they're not sort of heading for a breeding season. So the idea of doing this is quite interesting. If you combine that with things like, so there's a small Icelandic subspecies population that mainly remains in Iceland, but they quite often would migrate further south over the winter, so may well be seen in Scotland or Ireland. So are the birds that we see here, are they Icelandic birds, or are they Scottish birds that haven't moved, if you like, So, there's a lot of things there. I mean, this is one of the fascinations of ornithology, that sort of stuff there. I mean, a lot of the big science, I mean, I did my PhD in geology about 1,000 years ago. And a lot of the problems there are there now are huge, big megabucks projects that require many universities and many researchers and complex equipment and all that stuff there. So it runs into big bucks. Actually, ornithology is one of these, one of the sciences that you can actually make a solid contribution with a good pair of binoculars, a notebook and a pencil or a pen, and lots of patience. You can watch a particular species or a particular area and look at interactions and so on and so forth. And over a period of time, if you're fortunate and you're skilled enough, I guess you can begin to build up a real contribution to knowledge. But if you're looking at some of these things, that the throwaway comments in a lot of these science journals over the years, and there's so much online now. This is the other thing, there is so much. I've tried in the reference to the book, I've tried to give the URL, the what they call the DOI, the document object identifier, the web address, basically, for anything that's available online, that's freely available online. So that if you, for example, read something in the book that I've written and go, nah, I don't believe that. I don't think that's right. You can look at the reference and look at the original reference and see what the original authors have said, and see if I've interpreted that correctly or that's fascinating. I want to know more about that. You can delve into that yourself. There is so much. I mean, I was privileged in my career that I had access to, university libraries and online libraries and whatnot. But nowadays, there is literally, there are so many resorts, Biodiversity Heritage Library, there's a whole range of things that you can do. The SORA, the Searchable Ornithological Research Archive, that go back into, digitized journals, going to go back and back and back and back. So you can begin to build up this massive data set that is required to look at the nuances and look at the variations that you'll get across the behaviour in different parts of the world. And there's large chunks. If you go further east of us, I guess, from UK, you go further east, and there are large chunks of Central Asia and whatnot. We haven't got a clue what the hell's going on. That there's just not enough. There's just not enough bird watchers or not enough people working in that area, and it's a huge area and it's a complex habitat. So areas like, if you'll see in the book, there's a photograph there of birds from the northwest corner of India, and that's sort of India, Pakistan, Tibetan border there. That's a mixing ground of probably maybe 3 different subspecies. So, to be there on the spot and know what you're looking for, recognize what you see, it's a bit of a black art, really. It's something that you have to work at.
Yeah, I was going to ask. Obviously, I imagine that most of the people listening to this will have an image of a quote unquote Scottish Merlin in their heads, but the scope of the book is global, and you talk about lots of different subspecies, like the Icelandic one. Would you be able to just give us a quick overview of what the other subspecies of the Merlin are?
Okay, so there are three in North America, and they tend to get darker the further west you go. So the Taiga Merlin, Richardson's Merlin in the centre. The Taiga is the one that almost spans coast to coast, so it's the sort of biggest geographical spread, I guess, and pushing south, pushing into the USA. In the centre, in the plains, the prairies area, you have the Richardson's Merlin. And then on the west coast, you have the black Merlin, which is a darker species there. So they're much a smaller geographical area, but they tend to sort of keep to those areas. But there are obviously mixing of overlapping of territory, especially in the winter time when they'll maybe move into sort of northern parts of the USA. If you look at the species across the rest of the planet, there's the Icelandic one, there's the Eurasian one, which is UK and sort of Western Europe. Then you go further in, there's a steppe Merlin in the Russian areas. There's a Central Asian Merlin, and then there's one that goes. There's a far, the Eastern Siberian Merlin around the far right coast that goes right down to sort of Sakhalin and sort of northern Japan area, and that's as well. So there are all these different subspecies, and they tend to get slightly bigger, not hugely, but slightly bigger further east you get. So the slightly longer wings, for example, slightly bulkier, and being further north, the sort of the geographical birds tend to sort of bulk up in the more colder northern climes. So there are all these various versions, and in fact, there's even an ongoing controversy. It depends on you pay your money, you take your choice. Really, some people believe that the American Merlin and the Eurasian are different species; they're not subspecies. They seem to be that they've been separated genetically in the gene pool, and for probably about a million years. But are they the same species that have just changed and changed and changed and changed, or are they a different species? Well, that gets back to the argument about what is a species, and we don't. That's down that rabbit hole. We'll be here all day.
Is it the? I should mention that the book is beautifully illustrated and has big, full color photographs of some of these subspecies, as well as the Merlins in Scotland, some of which are taken by yourself. Is it the steppe Merlin that's that amazing sort of dusky coloured one, or that's beautiful? I'd never seen that before. Never even knew that existed.
Yeah. No, they are gorgeous. They are gorgeous birds.
Yeah. When so the book is obviously a mixture of your observations in the field and secondary sources, and you mentioned that so much of the time you were coming up against these dogmatic pronouncements on the Merlin and thinking, I'm not sure if that's right. A lot of the time it felt like this. You really had your work cut out in terms of debunking common knowledge about Merlins.
The book took 3 years to write. Okay, so that's not including the sort of decades before that of just watching Merlins and taking notes and scratching your head and whatever, and speaking to people and other enthusiasts and so on. So that's not all the sort of background stuff, but actually from the time I sat down to say, I'll give it a whack, I'll try and pull this book together, it took 3 years. And it took 3 years because and that writing, I would say almost every day, maybe not every day, but most days, even if it's only a paragraph or a second one, but it's writing about. And I was following that curiosity. I knew in my head what I wanted to find out and what I wanted to narrow down. And speaking with friends and colleagues and that, they're saying, well, why do we not know what to do in this situation or that situation? Or what is known about that? What is, So, for example, things like that, there are reputable ornithologists that go back decades or into the last century, who will tell you categorically that they don't have a courting flight. They don't have a courting behavior, right? We have never seen this at all. Therefore, it doesn't exist, Also, they never drink. They never drink water, or they never bathe. They never bathe in puddles, unlike other birds, or not. When you spread your net and you follow that, is that true? And you follow that in literature and speaking to people and, so on and so forth, you discover somebody else has gone, written a description of Merlins coming down and bathing in a puddle, for example, or eating carrion, or whatever. Things that are said, other people say categorically they don't do. And that's only because they haven't seen that at that particular time, and the evidence stacks up. That's how science progresses. I mean, I'm not knocking it. That's the way it goes. You're right until you have to prove that you're right until, and then somebody can falsify that and say, "Oh no, I've seen them doing that." Therefore, all of a sudden, that hypothesis is now, well, that's not quite as cut and dried as we thought it was. They do actually have this behaviour in certain areas. So. The writing of the thing was really driven by that curiosity to try and get a thread and follow that thread. What do we know about this? What do we know about that? And there are some amazing things which I discovered as we go through there that I didn't know about, but have been well and truly recorded. And there are certain really moments of pause as we go through there. I mean, I was in the National Museum of Scotland with Dr. Martin Stavander, who is the curator there, looking at some of the Merlin skins and eggs and whatnot. And of course, the eggs were used to build up part of the evidence for DDT and DDE, the eggshell thinning with pesticides in the environment. And pulling out a box of this in the museum, and I look at these things, and these. The eggs in this particular box, of course, they're all labelled in precise detail. These have been contributed by Derek Ratcliffe, and I'm going, my God, he's almost like a sort of demigod. This famous, scientist who was so meticulous, and I've read so much about him and his own book and books on raptors in the past. And you think you're looking at the same thing that he looked at so many years ago as it goes through. But things like pieces of dedicated research on a really fine point or a really fine topic, and then adding that into the mosaic. So a good example of that would be, it seems that Merlin and skylarks have a relationship. So skylarks that sing loudly and lustily and chirpily, whatnot, while they're being chased by Merlins. The result in the Merlins kind of break off the chase earlier, and the skylark survives. Whereas skylarks that don't, or sing poorly or don't sing at all, tend to get captured. And it's almost like the skylark is saying, "Don't bother chasing me. I'm fit and healthy. You can't get me." Blah blah blah. And this behaviour it doesn't happen in advance. It only happens when the chase starts. So it's a communicating signal, it seems to be, between the species or not. It's absolutely fascinating how these things. Does that apply to other species? Does that apply to other raptors that we haven't seen doing this? For example, the skylark do that with peregrines, or is it a different hunting technique that doesn't give them that opportunity? Things like, it's a subtle point, but collaborative or hunting that takes place at the same time between different species. So Merlins and hen harriers, for example, hunting in the same flight path as they go through a valley or over a moor or whatnot as well. And there's a definite impression that one bird will scare up songbirds, for example, in their passage, and the other species takes advantage of nipping in and catching these, having been scared. So, and they may well, play off against each other. So that sort of almost collaboration, is it fortuitous? Is it rehearsed? Is it a learned behaviour? There are all sorts of different interpretations in different areas, which could be, it's quite fascinating to watch that. I think it's again an example, not to be too dogmatic in you don't know what the Merlin's thinking. I mean, one of the things that drove me on this book was the sense of what it's like to be a Merlin. This dapper, fast flying, just an amazing bird. I look out the window here and I can see this, vast area of moorland in the north of Lewis here. And I love going out there. And going out there, you think you have something in common with the Merlin, this vast area when they're there. But they're so much more adapted. They can just, up and down and fly in a time that takes me hours to slog my way across wet moss and bog and round peat hags and so on and so forth and whatnot. So how do they adapt to that environment? Why do they choose that? How do they get there? How do they find that? How common are they within this area? I've gone out sometimes and I've seen maybe 3 different birds in the sky in different areas, which seem to me to be Merlins coming together at the edge of their different territories, for example, and they're hugely separated. So you have to choose which one you're going to try and follow up on that particular day, and obviously you choose the one that's nearest you because you don't have to walk, 7 miles across wet bog on the hunch that you're following something up there. So it's an intriguing species to follow.
I was going to ask you about the skylark with the pursuit deference song, because I've never I was amazed by that. It completely blew my mind. Is there anything like I've never read anything or there's any other sort of interbird song communication like that?
Yeah, but who knows? I mean, this is what we're at a very elementary stage in finding these things out. People are more prepared to put money into finding out AI imaging of foreign nudes than they are about birds on your door. It's not quite as intriguing or as sellable. But I think there's so much more that we need to know about these species. And if we did do that, I mean, obviously, like many species, the danger is the loss of habitat for breeding pairs. But again, it's not necessarily so black and white. If you look at area, I mean, in Lewis we have no ground predator. Well, no natural, like no foxes, no badgers, all that sort of stuff, no adder, no snakes, and so it's a more safe environment for ground nesting species. We do have things like hedgehog and mink and so on, but I mean, or polecats, but it's less intimidating. If you are in, there seems to be some evidence that Merlin do reasonably well on grouse moor, because gamekeepers are, shooting or capturing or killing predators on grouse, which are also that behaviour would benefit Merlins because they're less there. Again, it's not a simple choice. I mean, if you're looking at what species are you trying to protect here? What species are you looking at? If you're looking at a whole range of potential, I mean, in the index, for example, rather than talking about what it eats in the diet, in the chapter in diet, which would kind of be monotonous. They eat this and they eat that and they eat this, and I put it all in an appendix, and so you see that they eat a huge range of different species. And again, this is one of the things that I have, and I've quoted, perhaps unfairly, but I've used it to illustrate the point. I have quoted people who have said Merlins are generalist feeders, and then somebody else says Merlins are specialist feeders. Yeah, and they're both correct. They eat a particular weight of bird, a particular size of bird that they choose from. And they don't care if it's a meadow pipit or a wheatear. Basically, if they're going to catch it, right, or a cardinal in North America or whatever. So it's that sort of black and white thing. When you stand back and you look at it, you think Merlins are generalists in the sense that they'll take anything that is of an edible size for them to kill. They can't tackle some like a goose or something that's going to be huge like that. But they might take nestlings, because they're the right size. And so again, it's just looking at this in a bigger picture and not get too entrenched in your views. They are specialists in the sense they take a particular category of bird. but not specialists in terms of, they eat only Dunlin or eat only Meadow Pipit or whatever,
Yeah.
So that's worth thinking as well. There are lessons within this and I learned a lot about that myself. I mean, about myself doing this, because you tend to, obviously, reinforce what you've seen and you make sense of it, and then you see more of that behavior. And so it kind of reinforces that in your head. And perhaps you are less sensitive to alternative behavior that doesn't show that, because you're expecting to see a certain thing. You're expecting to see that. I mean, I was telling a friend just last night, in fact, at dinner, years ago when I was doing my PhD in Lochnagar, I was helping out with the visitor centre there, and going to lock up for the night. And this old lady came out the corner and said, "I've just seen an eagle sitting on a fence post around the corner." And I said, "Oh, that's really good, man. I don't think, madam, it's probably a buzzard, because buzzards tend to sit on fence posts, and and eagles are so huge that they don't do that. But buzzards regularly sit on fence posts, and I've seen them here quite regularly." "Oh, thank you very much, young man," she said, and she went away to her car. And I locked up the visitor centre, walked around the corner, and there was this eagle sitting on a fence post, and you think, how could it balance on this fence post? But it was undoubtedly a golden eagle. And so it was my conditioning that was what I expected to find that caused it. So she probably went back to Aberdeen thinking, "Yeah, I just saw this buzzard."
Just a buzzard, yeah. You mentioned the index, which is so broad and varied, and not just birds but also insects, and I think some amphibians as well. But a huge sweep of different birds. Readers will be staggered by how much they'll take. You mentioned that there's the possibility of using DNA analysis on their beaks and talons to try and actually pin down. Yeah, how would that work? And is there any signs of that happening?
Oh yeah, absolutely, it's happening. So on the insects thing first, quite often the younger Merlins will go after insects because they're easier to catch than more agile birds and whatnot. So it's almost like they'll get hunting practice, catching dragonflies and moths and whatnot. So there's a lot of evidence of that, and also sometimes on migration, going across marshes, because they fly at quite low levels quite often. You'll find clouds of moths, for example, or dragonflies and beetles around at that low level, and so they'll take them there. But the evidence of the DNA of what they're capturing has been done on the west coast of the USA. So there are sort of three big flyways going down north south for migrating raptors in general, but Merlins obviously included. The west coast, the east coast, and then a sort of central flyway. And down the west coast, they've been capturing Merlins, taking DNA swabs of the beaks and using that to look at the DNA from known genomes of other species to say what's been on that beak very recently. And so you don't even have to see them eating. You'll see what they have eaten, what they've been tearing into in a most recent period of time. So that's really fascinating how you might, tag in some of these things, and the possibilities creeping up now because of the advances of science, of revisiting things we looked at in the past, and being able to say more or less categorically what's going on. I mean, even tracing back the Merlins into fossil record. I mean, any fossil record is difficult, and any fossil record is patchy, problematic. We can't just go back and look at the animal itself, and we're depending on being lucky to find a fossil that's been fortunately preserved in a reasonable state within a rock that's accessible to us, and so on. So again, this pyramid of possibilities build up. If you are 50 meters away from a quarry that's still covered in earth and vegetation, then you don't have access to those rocks. There may well be important fossils in those rocks, as there are 100 meters away, but you can't see them and you don't know where to start looking for them. So you're never going to find them unless they start excavating that area. And so, and different parts of the world where people are paleontologists are more active, they're more likely to find find species and so on. So again, it's a pyramid of possibilities that stack up there. But looking back on that, you can begin to imagine over a longer period of time as the science becomes more sophisticated and much more precise, in terms of looking at things that are not doable just now. It's possible that we'll rewrite. And I've said in the book, this in the book, this is the state of knowledge just now. Undoubtedly, people will look at that and say, "Oh, that's not right. I don't believe in that," or "This is not." I've said since that, I've got some other story that will tell you that. That is a contribution to knowledge that will push the thing further on, and I'm fully prepared to admit that. But things like, for example, I was down again in the National Museum of Scotland just a few months ago there, looking at bird fossils. And one of my friends, Elsa Pancaroli, who's done a lot of work with dinosaurs in Skye. And while I was there, she showed me some of the stuff for the dinosaur remains that she'd found. And what they're able to do now is they can take the whole rock. So rather, previously, when I was at university, you would have to sit down with a rock and pick away with it with a little scalpel and remove bits of the rock and leave the skeleton steadily more exposed. With some rocks, that's more difficult to do than others, and you'll damage the specimen within the rock and so on and so forth. What they're able to do now is they take that, put it in a synchrotron, which is basically like a big CT scanner, or, an X-ray machine, if you like, and see what's inside the rock. So without breaking into the rock, you can see the remains of the bird's skull, for example, embedded wholly within the rock. And then you can then take that scanned 3D image and do a plastic 3D print of it. So you can recreate that at any scale you want, any size you want, there within the rock. So obviously I'm simplifying the process, but that is essentially what goes on there. So the potential of revisiting some of these things in the past and discovering more about for example, the articulation of fossils or the relationship between fossils and the earliest Merlins, or the deviation of Merlins from other because again, it doesn't fit into this. It doesn't fit neatly into this category of falcons and hawks. Some of its behaviour is hawk-like, but it's a definite falcon in its morphology. So again, it fits into this. Well, as you go through so many of the papers, and you'll find this for yourself if you delve into the reference list, so many papers, they'll describe something in great detail and then have a one-line throwaway that said, "Of course, Merlins are different." I'm left thinking, tell me more. Why are they different? What evidence do you have on this, or how many Merlins have you looked at to make that assertion, and so on and so forth? So it begins to build up much more complicated. I think we'll be going back and looking at some of these things in the past and looking at and this is why things like Merlin collections. If it hadn't been Merlin collections of eggs globally over years through the insecticide and pesticide poisoning period, then Derek Ratcliffe's index of working out how the thinning of bird eggs, that they were so thin that when the bird sent them to incubate them, they crushed them and so on. That story would have been more difficult to tease out as it goes through there. So I think a lot of that stuff is still to be discovered, still to be found out about. And there are loads of one-liners in the literature, for example, about first sighting of Merlin on this set area, shot on the 23rd of, you think, my God, no, not again, and right up until the early part of last century, this is not an ancient
icon,
an ancient practice. That was the way they identified. They saw it and they shot it and they said, this has never been found in this area before. Well. Not again for a long time, because they've just shot it.
Speaking of historical accounts of Merlins, you do spend some time in the book talking about the cultural significance of Merlins and their role and relationship with us, and particularly in falconry. But there's also the great sketch of Emily Bronte's pet Merlin, Nero. I just wanted to ask again, to to do with DNA. You mentioned the possibility of taking Mary Queen of Scots' falconry gauntlet to also to kind of map which birds of prey she flew. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, that was a fascinating thing that we went through there, because for a brief period, I was following a lead, what somebody had said to me, that Mary Queen of Scots' falconry gauntlet was actually held in the National Museum of Scotland, and then when I eventually traced it up there, they went, "Nah, that's not true. I don't think that's true." Um, and I think, well, did the person who told me that, who's now passed away, did they get it wrong? Is it a different museum that they're talking about? Why does nobody else know this? And so, taking the example of the swab from the beak of Merlin's know what it's hunting, if we actually had the falconry gauntlet itself, it may be possible to actually still take DNA on a swab of that to see what sat on that hand, because again, one of the leads that I was following up on over a period of time was this idea. I was looking at literature of all sorts, but I will mention people like Mary of Burgundy, Catherine the Great, Mary Queen of Scots, who were keen falconers, and quite often they'll say, and used Merlins. When I chased this up with Mary Queen of Scots, it seems to be anecdotal. There's no real evidence, and even people I've spoken to historians whose specialist subject is Mary Queen of Scots, and they say, well, no, we haven't seen this at all. So there seems to me, and I said in this in the book, there's a supposition that because Merlins were traditionally regarded as ladies' birds because they were so small, that if Mary Queen of Scots did hunt with falcons, it must have been a Merlin. But
Right.
actually, there's no conclusive proof on that. It's quite probably quite right, but not. It's not definite one way or the other. That sort of stuff there. So, I mean, she Mary Queen of Scots, even when she's in captivity, there's a record of Elizabeth of England tearing a strip off her jailer for allowing Mary to go out falconing with her captors. Don't let this woman out. Out in the countryside. That's the stuff. Get her back inside. And so we know that she was a falconer when she was in France, when she was married to the Dauphin. And was known anecdotally to sort of pursue that when she then came to Scotland and then was in captivity in England. So we do know that she was, at least a keen amateur falconer. Maybe amateurs, probably amateur, because I can't imagine she was doing all the cleaning of the cages and whatnot herself. She'd have a whole staff of people to do that sort of stuff for her. But we know that she was keen in that, but we don't really know what it was. So that would be fascinating if that glove turns up in some museum somewhere. We will grab it, and it may be too slim a chance, but there may be DNA evidence still in that thing there that says what species perched on that handle, and that would be a wonderful modern, twist on that story. And I think there may be other things out there that are part of that as well.
That would be amazing. Just to wrap things up, I mean, the theme of this conversation and very much one of the themes of the book is, as you've said, how adaptive Merlins are and how foxy a lot of the a lot of their behavior patterns are. On the you bring up DDT and the fact that Merlin seem to have somewhat recovered from the effect of that. But how is that broadly true, but locally more of a question? What is the current state of like the UK Merlin population?
It varies from place to place. It varies from area to area because it's not quite as simple as that. So there's the whole poisoning pesticide issue, but there's also persecution, and there's also habitat change. There's also human disturbance, and so in different parts of the area, So, for example, there are records of Merlin attempting to nest near people, and then getting scared off the nest basically, and not rearing any young. there are also stories of Merlin nesting on the ground in Wales and in Northern and whatnot, quite close to busy paths where hill walkers go walking, and without any apparent, unsettlement. We also know that in these Canadian cities, they're much more accustomed to seeing humans in the garden or in the park or whatnot, and much more tolerant of human activity. So it's not one size fits all. There's a whole variety of different issues that come through there. Perhaps so it is less threatened globally, but in certain areas it's still quite a threatened species. It's still on the red list for those localities. So, but again, it's about how narrow your focus is. If you're talking about if you're a bird watcher in Kent, for example, then you say, well, it's an extremely threatened bird. We don't see it here at all. It's definitely well up there on the need to protect species. In other parts of the world, they say, oh, not another bloody Merlin. They're everywhere. So you have to be a bit more. I think you need to take a bigger picture. You need to stand back and look at the big picture in these things and look at that. There are some good examples of Merlins being encouraged to re-inhabit certain areas with artificial nests. In other areas, they have proven really unsuccessful. They just don't like them. Yeah. So it is not one that fits all. Is again from that sort of stuff there. So it's about gathering more and more information to try and balance these things through. And this is again what the fascination of doing this book was. My style of writing and producing books and whatnot, which as I say, I've done probably nearly 40 books now, I guess, with various things. I like to write the book. I follow my own interests, my own things. I write the book and then I approach a publisher. So when I went to Pelagic Publishing and I said, I have this book, do you want to publish it? And they said, well, send it to us. And they read it and they came back and said yes. And I had a meeting with them and we talked about what, how it might be produced and whatnot as well. And the person from Pelagic said, well, normally at this stage I have to try and force the author for a submission date, but I've got everything from you. I mean, I had written the thing to my satisfaction. I had sent chapters out to various colleagues and whatnot to do peer review and say, well, does this concisely explain the issue, or should I change it, or can I say that? Should I say this? I got another couple of friends of mine who are good proofreaders to read this thing and check it. Even with the best will in the world, when you're writing something like this size, you might say there is rather than there are, for example. You read what you think you've written rather than what you've actually written. So yes. It's good to have another pair of eyes looking at these things. So I do all of that stuff. I think of that. I was thinking of them, all the photographs. I was thinking the whole index, the appendices, everything went not complete. And then I say, do you want to publish it? And as I say, Pelagic Publishing were great to work with. They were really, just flexible enough, but precise enough to get this thing. They specialize in environmental and scientific publications, whatnot. But to me, as I was saying at that particular time, this is the book of what I personally would want to know about the Merlin. This is what drove me. What do I know? Put it down. What do I not know? Let's look for these gaps, fill it out, tease the thing out there, speak to people. For example, at one point I was thinking, is there any evidence that's been noted about sea eagles, white-tailed eagles, preying upon Merlin, specifically preying upon them? And I contacted my old friend, the late John Love, who wrote the book on sea eagles and was involved in returning them to the wild in the UK. And we had a conversation on that because they don't specifically prey on Merlins, as it say, but they may parasitize them. They may steal their food if they're caught, killing a bird and whatnot, and they or wherever they appear, they may well snatch the food and sort of kleptoparasitism behavior and stuff, as do bald eagles in North America. So these conversations that were things that they're from people who have spent their lives, or a large part of their life, looking at individual species or behaviours of intraguild species of predation and so on, are really, really valuable, and they're not written down because in themselves they were just experiences rather than detailed studies as they go through there. I've got no evidence of people and they've been doing this, so I don't know, why they might do that. So that's really interesting as well. And things like when they're roosting, sometimes when they in mainland Europe when they're roosting, they may well roost with other species of falcons, and they'll all come together in a big tree for one night, and then they'll go away again the next day, sort of thing there. And so other people you speak to say, no, that doesn't happen. Other people will tell you chapter and verse when they arrived and when they left and how many there were and all that sort of stuff there. So it's about of having a little bit of humility in your ability as an observer, as a scientist, deciding what you can do with these things and piecing these things together slowly by slowly to build up the mosaic to give us the best picture we can. And that's what the fascination for me is. That's what the challenge is, how you communicate that in sort of, I'm not saying everyday language, but in language that's accessible enough for the most people without dumbing it down into sort of Dick and Dora type story about Merlin.
Well, I think you've done a beautiful job of that. I learned a lot and really, really enjoyed the book from start to finish. Anyone who wants to find out more about the Merlin should check it out. I'll make sure there's a link where they can get themselves a copy.